So good morning, everybody. I know some people are still coming into our session, but in the interest of time, we're going to get started, I think. Roger and I are just watching the numbers go up a little bit. It's a couple minutes after 11, so welcome. We have a very few brief words of introduction and essentially are going to launch right in after that. So let's see if we can get to 150 and then we'll start. We're at 149. Well, that's, oh, there we go. We've crossed the threshold. Okay. I will introduce myself very quickly, say a few brief words of thank you, and then Roger Chartier will begin our lecture. There will be images intermittently throughout the presentation, and we will leave some time for discussion at the end. We're very glad you could all join us. This is the first of 3 lectures, which go under the collective title of Textual Connected Histories and Global Legacies. Today's part 1 is entitled Words, Conversations, Colonization in the Era of Discovery, with discovery in quotes. We do think of these as separate lectures, so in a sense they stand alone, but hopefully there are many connections between them as you will see. I'm John Pollack, and I'm a curator at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts. That's at the University of Pennsylvania. We would really like to thank our good friends at Rare Book School for making this possible. We ordinarily teach Rare Book School courses in Philadelphia during summers. In a normal summer, Roger Chartier and I would have been teaching a course together. This is not a normal summer, but we're really happy that despite all of that, we can use this as a chance to rediscover our shared connections to each other, to books and to bibliography. So thanks again to Rare Book School. And I'm going to turn it over to Roger.
Okay. So these 3 presentations will be devoted to the perhaps unexpected relationship between bibliography and global history. Both terms need a previous definition. Global history will be understood by us as connected histories, to use a category introduced in the vocabulary of the historians by Sanjay Subramaniam in the seminal article he published in 1997. And we define bibliography as sociology of text, and following Don Mackenzie as, I quote, the discipline that studies text as recorded forms and the processes of their transmission, including their production and reception. For illustrating the possible or necessary relationship between the 2 perspectives, global history and bibliography, we would like to open this first presentation by paying homage to the essay that Don Mackenzie dedicated to the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in February 1840, by which 46 Maori chiefs gave the Queen of England sovereignty over the territories located in the 2 islands of Aotearoa, that is to say, New Zealand. Reconstructing the history of this fundamental text was for Mackenzie a way for illuminating the imposition of Western conception of literacy, writing, and printing on a totally oral culture. In the 25 years before the treaty, the Maori population of the 2 islands was subjected to a triple and rapid mutation. First, the indigenous speech was set down in alphabetical written transcription. Second, literacy in vernacular languages and not English was taught by missionaries. And third, printing was introduced in the island in 1830 with the publication of a catechism in native language, followed in 1837 by the publication of a Maori New Testament. The consequence was that missionaries and administrators thought or wanted to think that the Maori people were literate, whereas for the Maori, the book, reading, the written word, had not the meaning that the colonizers attributed to them. For the Maoris, the book was invested by propitiatory powers. Reading was understood as the recitation of memorized text, and the written word was secondary to oral conventions. That cultural gap acquired a political significance with the treaty. For the English, the chiefs have signed a document transmitting, I quote, all the rights and powers of sovereignty to the Queen of England, and thus they have recognized the legitimacy of colonial domination. For the Maoris, the fact of signing the treaty had no particular value because they considered as more important oral exchanges and oral commitments. Moreover, the term translated as sovereignty meant in Maori language only the acceptance of British administration. Since the publication of Mackenzie's lecture, some Maori historians have considered that the confiscation of indigenous lands in the 1860s were more fundamental perhaps than the treaty itself. But since the courts did not give any importance to oral testimonies, did not recognize the right of property transmitted by collective memory, and operated by written procedures, it is thus possible to say that these cases were, at a larger scale, the repetition of the contradiction between the oral culture and the power of the written word that characterized the signing of the treaty in 1840. The loss of sovereignty and the loss of their lands by the Maoris were the ineluctable results of a symbolic violence perpetrated thanks to the political and legal manipulation of an irreducible cultural gap. In the 19th and 20th century, Maori resisted against what they considered as a violation of their legitimate rights. Mackenzie's essay was a component of these protests because it tried to show how the supposed literacy of the Maoris, literacy according to the Western definition, had been used as a justification for the dispossession of their land, sovereignty, and rights. This lecture is a superb and a moving illustration of the possible or necessary humanist and civic commitment of a scholarly discipline. Today, our seminar will be devoted to three forms of transcription: in manuscript or printed text, transcription of the linguistic exchanges between Europeans and indigenous people at the age of the discovery, with quotation mark, as said John, and at the age of conquest and colonization, without quotation marks. First, the presence of indigenous words not translated, but explained by the context in the travelogues from Columbus' letter to Pigafetta's relation of Magellan travels. Second, the introduction within the relations themselves of bilingual lexicons that organize physical, social, religious realities according to the logic of list of words separated from the context of their users. Third, conversations, dialogues between native people or sovereigns and Europeans that were made possible by the presence of interpreters. interpreter who either had learned the language of the indigenous people, for example, the language of the Tupinamba in Brazil, known by French sailors and merchants settled there for making profit of the wood trade, or interpreter who knew a common language, for example, the Malay language in the Indian Ocean. The possibility of translation was the condition itself, allowing exchanges of words and commodities. It was an essential instrument for colonial domination, exercised by the translation of natives' words into judicial and administrative colonial concepts. Translation made also possible the process of Christianization, but in this case, by translating prayers, catechisms, sermons from Latin or Spanish or English or Portuguese into indigenous languages.
So we're going to begin as a first case with what we might call a phenomenon, as Roger said, of non-translation. The presence of Native American words that are transliterated in the earliest texts that survive from the Americas. So that survive from the contacts, conquest, and colonization of the Americas. These are words from native languages that are written and printed in Roman alphabetic characters mainly and inserted into European authored texts. Perhaps the most famous native word to enter European languages is actually so familiar to us that it usually goes unmarked in our editions as a foreign term. Canoa, canoe, canoe, and there are other variants of this well-known word. So most of us probably know in a general way that words like canoa entered European languages in the decades following the first transatlantic voyages. But we don't know too much about the ways in which these words were first transcribed or translated, nor about the multiple forms in which they circulated. We actually first see this word in a text thought to be authored by Christopher Columbus. Now we should say here that taking up the divisive career and ongoing fraught legacy of Columbus is unfortunately really beyond the scope of what we can talk about today. Nevertheless, here in Philadelphia where I am, a statue of Columbus has become again a site of violent conflict and controversy. As Mackenzie reminds us, bibliography and sociology are never far apart. Columbus and his shipmates captured native peoples from the very start. Several sources tell us that at least 10 native captives, Taino peoples, were taken to Europe in 1493. Many more native peoples from the Antilles made the transatlantic voyage as a result of the larger expeditions of 1493 and 94. Natives lived as slaves, servants, translators, or even citizens in Iberian and Italian court and merchant circles. Some captured Amerindians may have been grouped with captured Canary Islanders. Translators, as we know, are often invisible laborers, and these colonized translators may be the most invisible of all. We may be able to hear at least a few of their words in the earliest surviving physical document concerning the first voyage of Columbus. What we're showing you here is a single sheet folded into 2 leaves printed by Pere Posa in Barcelona sometime after March 14th, 1493, or in the beginning or middle of the month of April. There's only one copy of this printed announcement, which is usually called the Carta or Letter to Saint-Angel. This was rediscovered in Paris in 1889 in the end papers of a later book, and it's now held at the New York Public Library. In addition to 3 native place names, the Carta, this printed document, contains the first occurrences in print of the word canoa. We can see it twice in a passage on the verso of the first leaf. And I'm going to read here from Lucia Graves' translation, which is also on your screen. In all these islands, there are very many canoes, similar to longboats, some of which are large and others smaller, many being even larger than a longboat of 18 benches, but not as wide, for they're made of a single piece of timber. A longboat, however, could not keep up with them with oars alone, for they go with incredible speed. With these, they travel all over those islands, which are innumerable, and ply their merchandise. I've seen some of these canoes with 70 or 80 men aboard, and each with his oar. Did Columbus hear this word and dictate it to a scribe whose written version was set into type in Barcelona? Was it set down in writing by one of Columbus's scholar translators? Although those people had skills in Hebrew and Arabic, which proved entirely useless in the Antilles. Or could we imagine a native kidnappee doing the dictation? And we know of at least one captive renamed Diego Colon, who returned with Columbus on his second voyage. As you can see on the screen, if you look at the three examples at the bottom, this printed document actually contains 3 instances of the quote unquote same word, but each one of them is typographically distinct. Now, scholars have debated whether we should consider these printers' errors or clues to some original spelling that Columbus may have used. But really, I think there's no way to determine if any of these usages or which one is the accurate one any more than we can really judge between them at all. So there's a kind of textual instability here, and we'd like to suggest it's more than just a problem for editors. It should really give us pause when we make assumptions about the accuracy of any early printed representations of Native American languages. But at the same time, although we can't take these printed artifacts to be clear or accurate versions of native speech, we shouldn't go to the other extreme and dismiss them as mere European fictions.
Beyond the presence in European travel accounts of indigenous words, as we just see, textual connected histories must focus on bilingual lexicons that listed words and expression, and on conversations, dialogues between European and natives. For the list, let us consider 2 examples. The narrative of Antonio Pigafetta of Magellan's circumnavigation of the world gives us the first of this example. This text, written in Italian, is known thanks to 4 manuscript copies, 3 in French and 1 in Italian. It was first printed in French between 1525-1535. In his account of the arrival of Magellan ships at the island of Limasawa in the Moluccas Islands on March 28, 1521, Pigafetta, as Christopher Columbus, introduces indigenous words to describe the native boats he saw. I quote, "We saw a small boat that they call boloto. We saw several longboats approaching that they call balangai." He acknowledged that communication between the sailor and the inhabitants and their kings is made possible only because of the presence of an enslaved man on the ship, Enrique, who had been purchased by Magellan in Malacca in 1511. Enrique spoke the Malayan language that was understood throughout the archipelago. Pigafetta wrote, "This slave spoke to the king who understood him because in these countries, the king speaks more languages than the people." Malayan words are those that Pigafetta gathered in his manuscript when he gave in chapter 41 of his narration a bilingual lexicon with 368 words and phrases used in the Molucca Islands. He also presented a list of 155 words used in the island of Cebu in the Philippines, words that were coming from the Tagalog language. In the first an abbreviated Parisian edition, the editor did not keep this lexicon we can find in the manuscript, but the editor added at the end of the book a list of 49 words coming from the first list of the manuscript, and you have it on the right. And he also added, on the left, two brief lists of words from other languages, the language of the Tupi-Guarani of Brazil and the language of the Patagonian giants given by Pigafetta, because they stopped in these two places before arriving in the Indian Ocean, given by Pigafetta in the chapter 6 and the chapter 11 of his narrative. Second example, the Histoire d'un voyage fait en la terre du Brésil, autrement dit Amérique. History of a voyage to the land of Brazil, also known as America. This text by Jean de Léry was first published in 1578, and it included the three forms of translation we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture: single words, lists and lexicons, and conversations. The text narrates the attempt to settle a French colony in the Bay of Guanabara, today Rio de Janeiro, in 1555. The text is saturated with native words, translated within the text itself, and introduced by verbal formula such as what they call or what they name. Moreover, a lexicon at the end of chapter 20 provides translation for the domain of reality, the parts of the body, things belonging to the household and the kitchen or the cooking, and you have it on the page on the right, and to lineage. Finally, the documents at the relation at the end add a detailed table of contents included, and in alphabetic order. This table presented either the name of the protagonist, such as the colony's founders, Villegagnon, or Chartier, minister, why he was sent back to France. But this index also included native place names, Guanabara, arriver, or the indigenous object, Bucan, the savage rotisserie. In some cases, a native term is used in the Léry's narrative without being translated. For example, a verb, kawine. As for dancing, drinking, and kawine, that is almost their main occupation. And this word is used and put in the text before we learn the definition and the meaning of the term. I quote, the savage called this beverage kawin. Kawine is to drink. It is a cloudy and thick beverage like wine lees and has almost the taste of sour milk. In Jean de Léry's book, the question of translation is omnipresent because only translation allows for commerce between people. It is the reason why the truchement, the interpreter, are vital. These men, mostly from Normandy, were resident in Brazil and essential figures in the Brazilwood trade. They learned the Tupinamba language, and in a sense, they became Tupi themselves. In chapter 15, Léry describes them with a strong sense of condemnation. I quote, and you can read, to my great regret, I am compelled to recount here that some Norman interpreters who had lived 8 or 9 years in that country, accommodating themselves to the natives and leading the life of atheists, not only polluted themselves by all sorts of lewd and base behavior among the women and girls, by whom one of them had a boy about 3 years old when I was there, but some of them surpassing the savages in inhumanity, even boasted in my hearing of having killed and eaten prisoners. Though condemned by Léry, the interpreter, the truchements are nevertheless indispensable both for explaining the indigenous rituals and for translating words. In chapter 20, Léry presents a colloquy upon the entry or arrival in the land of Brazil among the people of the country called Tupinamba and Tupiniquim in the savage language and in French. Here is how Léry, and you have this on the page on the left, introduced this colloquy at the end of the preceding chapter, page 340 on the left. I quote, translating, "The readers will be able to see something more in the following dialogue, which was written while I, Léry, was in America with the help of an interpreter who lived there for 7 or 8 years and understood their language perfectly." Frank Lestringant argues that this colloquy is probably not the work of Léry, but was practiced and written by this interpreter from Normandy. As the dialogue itself reveals, when the Tupi asks, "What is the name of your country and your dwelling?" the Frenchman in the dialogue responds, "Rouen," that is the name of the city, Rouen, the main city and the harbor in Normandy. This colloquy, it would seem, belonged to the genre of manuscript documents prepared by and for traders and merchants traveling to Brazil, which would explain the presence of the 3 lists following the dialogue we have already seen, and the rudimentary grammar providing verb conjugations and tenses. Translation is a fundamental condition of exchanges. Without it, there is only barbarism. The Tupi participate completely in this perspective, and before he provides the dialogue, Léry recounts conversational exchanges he had with the Indian. For example, at the top of the page, "Women and girls," I quote, "are constantly bumping into us, always after us, saying, 'Mer, deagatorem amabe marubi,' that is, 'Frenchmen, you are so good, give us your bracelets and glass buttons.'" And on the right, the little boys, I quote, "are taught to say to foreigners that come near, 'De agatorem amabe pinda,' that is, 'you are good, give me some fish hook.'" For their part, Léry and his companions attempted to get the Tupi to acknowledge their own God, the Christian God. I quote, and you have this on the screen, "In our conversation with them, when it seems the right moment, we would say to them that we believed in a sole and sovereign God, creator of the world, who, as he made heaven and earth, with all the things contained therein, also now governs and disposes of the whole as it pleases him to do." Hearing us all forth on this subject, they would look at each other saying, "Hey," their customary interjection of astonishment. Conversely, people who refuse to engage in this commerce of words are true barbarians. It is the case of the Wetakas, and the text at the bottom of the page. These devilish Wetakas, different, profoundly different from the Tupinamba, remain invincible in this little region. And furthermore, like dogs and wolves, eat flesh raw. Eat flesh raw, that is to say, they are not the cannibal who are cooking the human flesh they are eating in their ritual of war. And because even their language is not understood by their neighbor, they must be considered to be among the most barbarous, cruel, and dread nation that can be found in all the West Indies and the land of Brazil. Furthermore, since they neither have nor wish to have any acquaintance or commerce with the French, Spanish, Portuguese, or with any from outside of the ocean, they know nothing about our merchandise. The Wetaka will not even speak with the Indian neighbors they trade with. They are the true savage, not only from the perspective of the French, but also from the perspective of the Tupinamba. In the era of conquest and colonization, translation were also a fundamental importance in the process of Christianization. The three provincial councils of Mexico, which met in 1555, 1565, and 1585, all reiterated the same stipulation. Conversion of people to the Christian faith must be done in Indian language. From this came the necessity to translate catechisms and muchas lenguas, and the need for members of the religious orders to learn native languages. The Mexican Council of 1555 refers to the interpreter religiosos y clérigos, interpreter friars and clerics, who were to teach native people the mystery of the faith necessary for their salvation. The Council of 1565 affirmed that all friars should know indigenous languages, and the Council of 1585 stressed the urgency of this learning process. I quote, "A period of 6 months is given to curate in charge of the Indians for learning their language under the penalty of deprivation of their office ipso facto if they do not do so." In Peru, the Third Council of Lima, held in 1582-83, imposed the use of Quechua for the work of conversion. I quote, "From today on, no Indian shall be obliged to learn prayers and the catechism in Latin, because it is more adequate and much better that they know and recite them in their own language. And if some among them wish, they may learn them in Castilian and Spanish. But except for these cases, there is no reason to require the Indian to learn them in any other language except their own." The process of Christianization in native languages had a fundamental consequence: the production of grammars and dictionary needed for learning Indian tongues. Some of these books remain in manuscript, while others were printed and became indispensable tools for clerics and administrators. In Mexico, the first of these was printed in 1555 on the screen, the year of the First Provincial Council, with the title "Aquí comienza un vocabulario en la lengua castellana y mexicana." It was the work of the Franciscan friar Alonso de Molina. This Nahuatl dictionary was followed by other printed vocabularios for languages including Michoacan, 1559, Maya, 1571, Zapotec, 1578, and Mixtec, 1593. In the first one we have on the screen, you can see on the right that the beginning of the alphabetic list of Indian words, the Aztec word translated from Nahuatl to Spanish, and also that in this copy some marginal annotation in front of some of the words. In Peru, the first Quechua dictionary, printed in 1586, just after the Provincial Church Council, was entitled Arte y Vocabulario en la Lengua del Perú, llamada Quichua y en Lengua Española. The first trilingual dictionary from Spanish America, Quechua Aymara Spanish, was printed in 1603 in Rome. The production of Christian books in indigenous languages made profit of the publication of these dictionaries and grammars. In colonial Mexico, as shown by Marina Garon Grayer, 5 genres constituted this printed production. The cartillas that gathered in very brief booklets, prayers, and catechism, the Doctrina Christiana that explain the essential dogmas and the meaning of the sacrament, anthologies of sermons, manual for confessors, and manual for the administration of the sacraments by the priest. Who were the intended readers of these books? Primarily, of course, the priests, curates, missionaries, friars, who could find in them the commandments and dogma they were required to teach in vernacular languages. But in the case of the cartillas or the Doctrinas Christianas, as shown sometime by the wills left by Indians, literate Indians could learn directly the rudiments of their new faith. Books played an important role, as we have seen, in the Spanish colonization. A colonization that was not only conquest of the land, confiscation of the gold, or enslavement of the bodies condemned to forced labor. Colonization was also an acculturation that imposed to the Indian's mind the European category of time, the European codes for visual representation, and the European concept itself of the individual. One fundamental issue raised brilliantly by Serge Gruzinski's books, The Conquest of Mexico and Images at War, was the relation between Christian iconography and Indian idolatry, quotation mark. Between the colonizers and the colonized, both iconographic convention and the meaning itself of the images were different. After the destruction of the Indian figura de hombres, or idols, by the missionaries, the multiplication of Christian images in multiple forms on the walls and in the books, frescoes, paintings, sculpture, crucifix, tapestries, engravings, imposed motives and codes, the perspective, the realistic portrait, totally foreign to Indian codices that use chromatic contrast, a unique dimension, and separated and juxtaposed motifs. Moreover, for the Mexicans, images were not representation, but presence of the sacred. In Nahuatl languages, this immanence of the divinity was designated by the word Ixiptla. The missionary used it for naming the Christian images and thus created reciprocal misunderstanding. If the colonizers condemned Indian religious objects by using the theological category of idolatry, inversely, the Indians will look at the Christian statues or images as if they were new Ixiptla. The consequence was a production of hybrid representations and syncretic beliefs. On the one hand, the process of evangelization reused the traditional pre-Hispanic religious sites. On the other hand, Indians appropriated in their own way the Christian symbolism, symbolism turned sometimes against the colonial domination itself. These exchanges did not erase, however, the irreducible tension between the representation of the sacred and the immanence of the divine. This tension was also essential, as we know, for the Catholic users of images everywhere. This the doctrine of images as established by the decree concerning purgatory adopted by the Council of Trent in his last session in 1563. For the Church, the Catholic Church, the issue was twofold. Against Protestantism, it was necessary to reaffirm the legitimacy of the intercession of saints that abridge the suffering of the hold in purgatory, to reaffirm the legitimacy of the cult of relics and of the use of images. Against idolatry and superstition, it was necessary to recall that the images were not embodiment of the divinity itself. Superstition, Europe itself. The images of Christ, of the Virgin, of the saints, the text of Trent does not mention God the Father, represent these prototypes, the Virgin, the saints, Christ. And the two words, representation and prototypes, are the word used in the Latin text. The difficulty raised by this Catholic theology of the images resided in the fact that if the images are not the divinity, they are, however, sacred, because they bear similitude with Christ or with the saints. The word similitudo was not always enough for prohibiting the belief in the immanent power of the Christian sacred object whose destruction or profanation was held as a crime of sacred lèse-majesté. In colonial Mexico, the book painted by the Indian painters, no more the book printed by the Spanish printer, but the book painted by the Indian painters after the conquest had a double dimension, legal and religious. Some of them are weapon used for destroying idolatry, that is to say, for substituting Christian text and iconography for the burnt pre-colonial codices, whereas others are presented as proofs of the indigenous community's rights. All were the result of multiple transactions. Let us take a spectacular example. The Codex Mandate, painted between 1530 and 1560 in Mexico City. It is an exceptional document. It was painted by an indigenous Mexica painter, and you can see written glosses in Spanish that were introduced in the book by a legal scribe or notary. This codex was traditionally considered as a paradigmatic example of the hybrid object produced by mestizo culture. However, a recent article by Daniela Bleichmar in the Renaissance Quarterly interprets it in a new manner as the result of multiple translations. The painted images, painted by the Mexica painter, were explained in Nahuatl. This explanation were translated into Spanish by a Nahuatl Spanish interpreter, and the scribe set down these oral accounts resulting from the translation, and he introduced them on the pages of the Codex. The book is the extraordinary result of a series of translations, and I quote the text by Daniela Bleichmar. Translation from the image to the spoken word, from the spoken word to the written word, from Nahuatl to Spanish, from pictographic writing, the glyphs used by the Aztec that denote both words and sounds, to alphabetic writing. End of quote. This codex
also located in a new colonial context, the information about the Aztec past or present, because the Codex charted the military history of the Aztecs, presented economic and fiscal information, and finally provided an account of everyday life and custom of the Aztec people. Thus, different forms of cultural translation between modes of communication, between languages and forms of writing, between modalities of knowledge are inscribed on each page of the Codex Mandate. The glossars imposed Spanish categories to Aztecs realities, realities both translated and betrayed. For example, the designation itself of the Mexica Tlaquilo, painter, deeply misinterpreted the complex nature of these indigenous painters, with quotation marks, who were scribes writing the glyphs, singers singing the images, and loved scholars who knew sacred knowledge about the past, nature, and the supernatural. Samuel Purchas reproduced almost the entire pictorial content of the Codex Mandate in a chapter of the third volume of his 1625 four-volume edition of his Accluius Posthumus, or Purchas's Pilgrims, containing a history of the world in sea voyages and land travels by Englishmen and others. He describes the Codex as a Mexican history in picture, as a chronicle without writing, as a history without letters, as wrote Daniela Blechma, concerned above all with the indigenous component, Purchas considered the images as a true, indeed the only content, forgetting both the alphabetic Spanish writing and the pictorial writing given by the Greeks. For him, the alphabetic writing in Spanish had no particular relevance, and he substituted it by his own commentaries, and you can see this on the right at the bottom of the page. Purchas images were often reproduced in other books, making the Codex Mandate, I quote the most reproduced and analyzed Mexican object in early modern Western publication. But a reproduced object with the divorce and not the intricate translation between Mexica images and their Spanish written glosses.
So at this point, we're going to turn to three other documents from, in this case, University of Pennsylvania collections. Just to give some more examples, three more examples showing the transcription of indigenous languages and the multiple aims and objects that those transcriptions and translations have. The first we'd like to show you is the so-called Indian Bible, I put that phrase in quotes too, in the Wampanoag language, both Old and New Testaments, which was translated by a Puritan missionary, John Eliot, along with indigenous Christian converts, Job Nezitan, James Printer, and others whose names we don't know, and printed at Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1663. This is, as some of you may know, a remarkable feat of missionary printing, and it was intended, we believe, for minister missionaries, but also for converted and literate Wampanoag Indians. A second edition of this Bible was printed in 1685, and some surviving copies, like Penn's copy, which is the higher of the two images in this slide, some surviving copies do show manuscript use by converts. So we see both printing and of an indigenous language and the use of that written form of an indigenous language by indigenous converts in an image like this one. We're moving rapidly through North America here. And our second example is from further north still. This is a manuscript grammar dictionary of the Huron language, known usually today as Wendat, with translations into French of some expressions. So this is an entirely manuscript. And manuscripts like this were addressed to and made usually by Jesuit missionaries in New France, Canada, in order for Jesuits to teach themselves and their converts about the possibilities of and pitfalls of indigenous communications. Just to show you a little detail of this complicated manuscript, two examples of French translation. Ce brave homme est mort, this brave man is dead, in the upper phrase. And then the lower of the three phrases, il s'est montré peu courtois à notre égard. He wasn't very polite with us. So occasionally these grammars give us tiny glimpses, you might say, of exchanges between the Jesuits and the Wendat peoples whom they were attempting to convert. Our third document of this series returns us to Central America, and this is a manuscript chronicle of the Kachekel people, which chronicles their history from their arrival into central Mexico up to the year 1604. It's a remarkable document. The text, as you can see, is actually written in alphabetic writing, but in the indigenous Kachekel language by two Kachekel nobles who were named Francisco Hernandez Araña and Francisco Diaz. We do know their names. In this case, the linearity of the written narrative is substituted for the glyphs and paintings of the pre-colonial and colonial codices that we've seen before.
I think it is time to conclude. Connected histories are also the history of those translators who not only translated languages, but translated also cultures. Here, a remarkable example analyzed by Natalie Zemon Davis is Hassan al-Wazan, who became Leo Africanus, or in Arabic, Yuana al-Hassad, after he was captured by Christian pirates in 1580 and entered in the household of the Pope in Rome. Converted and baptized 2 years later, becoming Leo Africanus. Living in Rome, Leo the African worked with the Jewish doctor Jacob Montino on an incomplete Arabic, Hebrew, Latin dictionary. He also wrote books in Latin and in Italian for introducing Islam, Africa, to his European readers, patrons, and readers of his book. The most famous of these books is his 1526 manuscript, Libro de la Cosmografía y Geografía de África, is the title on the manuscript text. The text was edited and published by Giovanni Ramusio in 1550 and with another title, De la descrizione dell'Africa e delle cose notabili che ivi sono. Translator of his former work, because he had made expedition, diplomatic expedition in Africa. Translator of his experiences, and finally translator of himself. Leo Africanus would look exceptional. However, we can consider him as doubly representative. First, representative of all those men and women forced into the place of the translator and into the learning of new languages by captivity, by displacement. Secondly, representative also because in all of his books, lexical choices, prudent subtleties of translation could hint at the continuing presence, hidden but decipherable, presence in his mind, in his heart, of his former world, of his former faiths. Thanks to the printed words, we are able to decipher those discrete traces. It is the reason why we believe that translation, which often expresses, consciously or not, reticences, resistances, memories, must be considered as a smaller scale version of textual connected history. And it is also the reason why we think that bibliography is now a fundamental tool for writing global history.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you both. That was really wonderful. What a great way to kick us off on this fabulous topic. So if anybody has any questions, we are now accepting them in the chat. So let's just kick it off. Great, and I see we already have a few. Alex Wingate asks, do these colonial dictionaries, grammars, and religious texts featuring indigenous languages imply the presence of indigenous compositors / correctors in print shops in the New World or in Spain? As a second question, they ask, or were authors more likely to be used as correctors for indigenous texts in these works?
This is a great question.
John?
I think that the short answer is we wish we knew a lot more than we do know. I myself, in looking at the early material in the 1490s, early 1500s, I think we can only find hints. There absolutely are native peoples living in some of these households, and so it's certainly plausible to imagine a presence in the printing shop. I think in the case of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the 1660s, we can absolutely see their presence, although it's really only in the last few decades that we've sort of acknowledged it. John Eliot's name is present on the title page, and he seems to assume all the credit, but we now know that that certainly could not have been the case.
I think also it's a wonderful question, but I have no direct answer. I suppose we have not sufficient work about the printing processes in, for example, Mexico or Lima, where the printing presses were present very early, particularly in Mexico since the late 1530s. I don't know if there was the introduction in the printing shop of Indians trained to the work of the compositor. Another part of the production we have to think about was the portable presses of the missionary in the Jesuits presence in Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina today. There was this series of misiones in which there was not only a place for protecting the Indians from the colonizers, but also for evangelization and Christianization, and they have printed particularly the smallest kind of text. And in this case, it was done often with the portable presses and by some of the Jesuit trained for composing typographically the text. The second question was about?
Sorry, the second question was, or were authors more likely to be used as correctors for indigenous texts in these works?
Authors. Okay, I mean, which is sort of a equally complicated question, especially in this case of, you know, what is an author of this kind of text? I mean, I think we can talk about a certain kind of author in the case of Jean de Léry and his relation, which was of course printed in France quite a long time after his return. And there's some, you know, interesting questions there about the materials he would have prepared in Brazil versus those prepared later in France. Roger might have some thoughts on that. It is, I like to think of a lot of these grammars, dictionaries as really, you know, at the very least multi-author texts. And I think there is a place to see, if you want to call it that, native voice, native authorship in them, much more so than we typically have done, you know, in a sort of older bibliographic tradition. These were thought about as kind of heroic projects by missionaries whose work was to be lauded. I suspect most of us today would take issue with that characterization, and as a result, we of those earlier thoughts, we really didn't look that hard for the place of the indigenous peoples in their production. And I think there's great work that people are doing, and more that we want to do along that line.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jane, who asks, do you find that translators are referenced or credited for their contributions, or are they typically invisible?
Of course, there is two type of translator we have perhaps not sufficiently distinguished. On the one hand, we have this interpreter and acting with the first encounters, allowing this series of commerce of word, commerce of goods, of commodities. And as said John, some could be identified, but it's rare. Enrique, for the in the case of Pigafetta and Magellan's travels. So there is all this classes of translator, interpreter, anonymous, collective, or individualized, which were at the first mediation for establishing a relationship between the European and the different indigenous people. After, we have the translator who translate for printing or for establishing a manuscript. And this here would be a complex issue, of course, from a large part of the typographic production we have discussed today. The translator are the religious member of religious order, particularly Franciscan or Dominican, who had acquired the knowledge of the indigenous language and are able to make this huge, and as said John, collective endeavor that are this dictionary of Indian languages, and whose name appear, in fact, on the title page. More generally, the question of the name of the translator as the author of a book could have not only the context of the context we discussed today, but more generally. And I think it could be a complex issue because there is no, it seems to me, general rule. Sometimes the name of the translator appear, and even when the name of the author does not appear. It's a case of we anticipate, in anticipation of the third lecture, of some of the translation of Don Quixote. Cervantes is absent, but the name of the translator is present, either because everyone knows who has written Don Quixote, or because it's not necessary for this kind of genre of text to have the name of the author. The question of the translator is also the question of when we are outside of this translation made by religious people for religious purposes, are the question of the translator either as an activity which can be practiced as a pleasure or a leisure by some aristocratic figure, or the activity as practiced as a first form of professionalization of writing. We can recall that the translator in the 16th century were the first one to receive money for their work, whereas the author received copies of their copies of the edition. They can distribute to thank their protector or to get new protector. So the monetarization of writing was strictly connected in France, for example, in 16th century, with the activity of translation. And you have this paradox of the translation considered as despised because considered as a pure copy without any sign of invention. For example, when Don Quixote meets a translator in Barcelona, the discourse of Don Quixote is the discourse of the despising of an activity which is a pure copy. And in Spanish, the same verb was used for copying a text or translating a text, trasladar. But on the one hand, this low esteem attributed to translation because it doesn't signify or express any invention within the imitation, which is a rule for the aesthetics. And on the other hand, the fact that there is a market for the translation and that the translator can make profit, make money of their activity. And perhaps with the translation, we have the first transformation of the relationship between authors, quotation mark or not, and publisher. For example, not only the payment directly in monetary reality, but also, for example, the payment in advance of a manuscript not yet delivered, or even, and this is for the activity of printing, in Paris, the success of the chivalric novel, the Spanish translated chivalric novels was so great that some printers started to print without having received the totality of the manuscript. So there are a series of innovations which are connected with the translation, and I think this ambiguity about professionalization of writing, and in another direction, the fact that translation cannot be considered as equivalent to the invention of text by the author. But of course, the word author was also used for translator and since the Middle Ages. And when you have an author offering a book to the patron in many miniatures, this author is not the author of the text, he's a translator of a classical text. Or even in Spanish, in this visit in the printing shop by Don Quixote, the translator who had translated the book from Italian into Spanish and expect a lot of money for this, is always called the author. So it's a complex issue. We can come back in the next presentation, but it seems to me with ambivalence at the early modern time.
And I think the ambivalence is only increased when you, in the colonial context. Jesus, I think in the chat, mentions a book that I will just echo here as a great study by our colleague and my old friend Cami Townsend on Dona Marina in the translator interpreter for Cortez, the book Malinson's Choices. She, of course, was famous, famously known, unlike many of these figures. And although we know less, she's certainly part of the process of spoken interpretation. I think we know less about her work on the written side. So that's absolutely something, an additional point. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Our next question comes from Susan Garfinkel, who asks, how would you relate these apparently careful attempts at cultural and linguistic translation with some of the more fantastical images of indigenous people and animals from other continents that were printed in Europe during this same time?
Another another good question. Yes, some of you will have noticed that we carefully skated around some of the more controversial and fantastical subjects like the cannibal and the image of the cannibal that we could have given an entire lecture on, especially if our good colleague and friend Peter Stalybras had been here. Fantasy and reality, translation and imposition. They coexist. I think they coexist throughout all of these texts. You know, we can see both a European projection at every turn, starting with Columbus, and also nonetheless a sense that natives and native voices are present, and their voices are present in these texts that we can use our bibliographical toolbox to help explicate. That is not to say that fantasy and violent projection doesn't shape in many ways the colonial realities of these worlds.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting point, because on the one hand, you have this persistence of the medieval representation of this people who are like in the churches, in the sculpture, all these extraordinary people. And if we accept the idea according to which the printing press has multiplied the text already present and not as created immediately or rupture and the transformation of knowledge, there is the printing press could have play a role in this persistence of a traditional iconography of the other. The panoti, the people with the large ears, or the people who have the head in there between their legs and so on. All this imagery which resist, and particularly appeared sometimes in the cosmographies or in the margin of the maps. And in vis-a-vis this repetition of the medieval iconography, the travelogues and their description, which can also be influenced by this previous knowledge, but we try to be based on the eyewitnessing, and attention paid to this, I said, the question, this careful attempt at cultural and linguistic translation, which also are ambiguous, because on the one hand, it could be, you remember the title of a book by Stephen Greenblatt, This Marvelous Possession, that is to say the marvel of the discovery and the moment of the encounter with an unexpected reality, which could be like an enchantment and required this careful, meticulous observation. But immediately after the possession were not only marvelous, they were also guided by the fight against idolatry and by the process of colonization. And in this sense, which was perhaps a kind of knowledge sufficient in itself, become a weapon or a tool for imposing a new face and for the administration of territories and people. And the reason why we skip over this in the lecture, it would be interesting to make this kind of crisscrossing between what was in the lecture, that is to say, to translate into native languages, particularly the Christian gospel and Bible, and all the texts which could be derived and used for this process of Christianization, catechism, sermons, theatrical plays, and so on. And conversely, to translate into the language of the colonizer in the courts or in the administration the words of the indigenous and people, victims or testimonies or accused and so on. And so you have these two different trajectories from the Latin to the indigenous languages for Christianization, and from the indigenous tongues to the language of the domination, either in the justice or in the administration, imposed in effect on people who were deprived of their linguistic identity in this sense. And so I think it could be this a way for explaining the care, in a sense, why there was this attention and the tension between the pleasure or the enthusiasm of the discovery, and on the other hand, the instrumentalization of this knowledge. It was to come back to our first quotation, Don Mackenzie's article and lecture about how the manipulation of the oral culture of the Maori was at the service of the colonial endeavor.
Excellent. We have a follow-up to the question that was just asked. This comes from Sarah Werner, who asks, does it have in part to do with needing accurate language to convert indigenous peoples, but that the herbals and fauna images are about playing to audiences back in Europe, and the benefits of exoticism from getting support for expeditions? I can read that again if that would be helpful.
I have entered into the chat, so perhaps I can find the question itself. No.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for this question. Go ahead, reread, Laura, if you would. Yeah.
Certainly. Does it have in part to do with needing accurate language to convert indigenous peoples, but that the herbals and fauna images are about playing to audiences back in Europe, and the benefits of exoticism for getting support for expeditions?
Yeah. I have no knowledge particular about it, but it's clear that another use of this was not only, as I said, for the Christianization or for the administration. It was also, which in this sense, it's a form of a translation, not as the hospitality for the other, but as a form of symbolic violence. And this could be also a topic for our reflection, the tension between the translation understood as a way for understanding the other, for welcoming the other and your own language. It's a topic developed by the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, the idea of translation as hospitality. But at the same time, in the background of the question, there could be also the translation as exercising a form of violence because it deprived the indigenous of their language for the administration and for justice, or because it is the vehicle for imposing and not only a symbolic imposition, but also a brutal one, a conversion. And so this ambivalence could also be connected with what is supposed, that is to say, in Europe, this presence of the native people, their language, their customs, their practices, could have an effect of exoticism, and this exotic perspectives at the service of the expedition, and to show the importance of the colonial world, not only in terms of economic exploitation, but also because it's a more noble idea in terms of exchanges or encounter. And I think that this permanent tension between the encounter as a constituting figure of mankind and the colonial endeavor submitting all this territory and people to the rule of the colonizer for the profit of the metropolis, was also a constant tension, which are in this text and in many other forms of the presence of the Indies, whatever they may be, in European imagination or mind or desire.
I think Sarah's response also raises a good point that we need to always be careful. We're talking about multiple kinds of audiences, plural, across a wide range of very different kind of texts, multiple discourses. So it's perhaps always a little dangerous to overgeneralize about a European, just as we would want to be careful about a native sort of mode of representation or voice. And certainly, you know, as our Penn colleague Nancy Farris has investigated in detail, there was an enormous effort to, on the part of the Christian missionaries, to think through the processes of translation and what, you know, the proper interpretation of Christian concepts could be across native languages in colonial Mexico, in North America, in Peru, in many places. So yeah, that debate is essential, but it's very different in different places, and so audiences and discourses are going to vary quite a lot, even in the same time period, I think.
Thank you so much for that fabulous answer. Since we're running out of time, I believe this will be our last question, but thank you so much to everybody who has brought to the table so many incredible questions. So our final question will be from Raul Aguilera, who asks, are there any case studies that lead us to believe that the colonizers' appropriation of local indigenous terminology has spread to other places thanks to the missionaries?
I mean, this may seem like a bit of a facile answer, but the word that we began with, canoe, is a case not so much of missionary transportation, but probably of one word being reimposed across multiple cultures, such that a particular kind of native sailing vessel becomes called a canoe in all places and all contexts, no matter what the native vocabulary might have been. Yeah, but this is a question about missionaries and their own appropriations of native terms. Yeah, that's a. I mean, there certainly are some situations in Canada where we can see missionaries debating how to translate concepts like the Trinity and what native words to use in those translations. With discussions of the danger of those kinds of processes, because the danger of adopting a native concept from a Jesuit point of view would be that it would actually be encoding an entire different belief system that they're trying to work around. Nonetheless, there's lots of use of native terminology by missionaries in their translations. I think that's true across the Americas. It's only kind of a half answer. I have to think about that. It's a big question.
All right, well, would you like to take another question or?
Sure.
With pleasure, yes.
Let's just have a look here.
Thank you for people putting in the references too in the
Exactly.
chat.
I was thinking about this.
Yeah.
The reference to the article on the Codex Mandate.
It's a great article. RBS has already asked us to do this. I'll try to put together a little bit of a reading list of some of the things we referred to. Probably will be for all 3 lectures that we can put on the website later on, just citing some of the sources that we've been using, like
Great.
Mackenzie.
Yes, thank you so much for doing that. So this will be our final question, comes from Ileana Bayard, who asks, can you elaborate on the iconographic conventions used in some of these works and their impact on constructing a particular representation of the colonized places?
Yes, I have lost the image of Zoom, but I suppose you can hear me. Okay. Yes, I think it was one of the main issues of this book by Serge Gruzinski about the images at war, La Guerre des Images in the French title. And also in the first of the book, the Colonisation de l'imaginaire, poorly translated as the conquest of Mexico. Because the idea that was not only concept, but also systems of representation could be confronted, and in fact, the convention and codes of the Western European representation were imposed to a category and a convention completely different, and particularly this idea of the perspective, the idea of a representation which could be like the similitude to the prototype, to speak like the Council of Trent. And if you look at the representation of spaces or of narration of individual in the codices, the codices we have, particularly after the conquest, because one of these violent forms of acculturation was immediately since the beginning of the 16th of all the pre-Hispanic, as we say now, codices. So it's an entire world of books which have been destroyed. And very few, as you know, are the pre-Hispanic codices. But we have it like the Codex Mandate, ambiguous, ambivalent, hybrid, transactional form of production of a book. And so even in the absence of this, we have this tension between 2 system representation, one imposed as dominant, and sometimes the previous one resisting in the manner of representing the things, or in the introduction of specific motive which were familiar to the pre-Hispanic codices and entered into frescoes, for example, in the churches in Mexico. So I am not an historian of art, but it would be interesting to have a systematic series of opposition for being more precise upon the difference of representing spaces, beings in the Mexica and in the Western Christian culture. But it was one of these fundamental attempt to impose not only your new beliefs or to impose a new political authority, but more profoundly, more deeply to colonize the mind. And perhaps because you can use here a concept here to Pierre Bourdieu, the symbolic domination is a condition of the reproduction of the domination. You can use force, but not always and not forever. What is the guarantee of the reproduction of a domination is the fact that the dominated, in a manner or another, agree with the principle which establish their status of dominated. And of course, this mechanism, which can be reproduced during decades or centuries, could also be, at a certain moment, challenged, fissured, destroyed, and finally overcome. But it takes a long time. And so the colonization of the mind was a condition of possibility of the other forms of the colonization. And when the importance to understand of the important endeavor, that is to understand this process which imposed categories, and these categories being the background for the imposition of economic, demographic, social imposition.
And I would just, sorry, by way of coda only, since on the question of images, reminds me of an acknowledgement that we would like to make, that you will of course seen the presence of images throughout our talk, and you will hear more discussion in the next lectures about the role of image and text. So we could not have done a talk like this today without the digital presence of images. They're not the same artifacts as the books we consult in person, but a quick shout out to all the libraries which we acknowledged throughout our slides, thanks to whose online libraries we've been able to actually make this, give this talk of images a virtual presence.
Yes, thank you so much for making that point, especially during this time. Well, we'd like to give you a very warm thank you for this fabulous presentation. For anybody still in the group, we will be having our second session on Monday, July 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and we really look forward to seeing you then. Once again, thank you so much to Roger Chartier and John Pollack for this fabulous, fabulous talk. We look forward to
Thank you very much.
Thank you.